Welcome back to Timeless Thinkers, where history's greatest minds speak again, and where we explore the ideas that shaped our world. I'm your host, and we've journeyed through Machiavelli's ruthless political realism, Hobbes's terrifying case for absolute sovereignty, Locke's revolutionary argument for natural rights and limited government, and Rousseau's radical vision of direct popular sovereignty, where the people themselves must continuously exercise legislative power. Today, we meet the philosopher who took a completely different approach to the problem of political freedom. While Rousseau demanded that the people rule themselves directly through continuous participation, while Hobbes insisted on absolute sovereignty to escape chaos, and while Locke trusted in natural rights and the people's right to revolution, Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu, asked a more pragmatic question. How do you design institutions that prevent tyranny even when rulers aren't virtuous, even when citizens aren't vigilant, even when human nature remains flawed and ambitious? His answer would prove more practically influential than any other Enlightenment philosopher's political theory. This is the story of The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, and how Montesquieu transformed political philosophy by shifting the fundamental question from who should rule to how government should be structured, giving us the separation of powers, checks and balances, and the institutional architecture that nearly every modern constitution still follows today.
Charles Louis de Secondat was born on January 18, 1689, at the Château de l'Ébride, near Bordeaux, France, into a family of provincial nobility with deep roots in legal and administrative traditions stretching back generations. His mother died when he was 7 years old, leaving him to be raised in an environment that emphasized both aristocratic privilege and serious commitment to public service. Unlike Hobbes, who fled civil war and witnessed its horrors firsthand, or Locke, who participated directly in revolutionary politics and conspiracies against the English crown, or Rousseau, who challenged civilization itself from the margins as an outsider and self-educated provocateur, Montesquieu was thoroughly an establishment figure. He was born into power, educated for power, and expected to exercise power. In 1708, Montesquieu studied law in Bordeaux and then Paris. In 1714, he became a councillor in the Bordeaux Parliament, essentially a regional court with significant judicial and administrative authority. Then in 1716, he inherited from his uncle both the title Baron de Montesquieu and the prestigious position of Président à Mortier in the Parlement of Bordeaux, one of the highest judicial offices in the region. He was now part of France's noblesse des robes, the aristocracy of office, as distinct from the old military nobility. This gave him insider access to how power actually operated, how courts functioned, how laws were applied, how political maneuvering worked behind the scenes. He wasn't theorizing from the outside. He was observing from within the machinery of government itself. But Montesquieu was restless with routine legal work. His intellectual interests ranged far beyond adjudicating property disputes and inheritance claims. He studied natural science, conducted experiments, and wrote papers for the Bordeaux Academy on topics from the function of kidneys to why echoes are sometimes stronger at night. He had the Enlightenment's characteristic curiosity about everything.
In 1721, he published Persian Letters, a satirical novel featuring two Persian travelers, Uspek and Rika, observing French society with bemused critical detachment. Through their supposedly naive foreign eyes, Montesquieu brutally critiqued absolute monarchy, religious intolerance, aristocratic pretension, and social hypocrisy. The book was published anonymously, wise given its sharp criticism of Louis XIV's regime, but became an immediate bestseller, captivating Enlightenment Paris with its wit and social commentary.
The success of Persian letters established Montesquieu's reputation as a major intellectual figure, but his real ambition was larger and more systematic. He wanted to understand political systems scientifically, not as a moralist prescribing ideal governments based on abstract principles, but as an observer analyzing how different systems actually function in practice and why some preserve liberty while others inevitably collapse into tyranny. This empirical comparative approach set Montesquieu apart from most political philosophers. He wasn't starting from first principles about human nature or natural law. He was collecting data, observing patterns, analyzing what worked and what failed across different times, places, and cultures. In 1726, Montesquieu sold his judicial office, a significant decision that freed him financially and professionally. 2 years later, in 1728, he embarked on extensive travels across Europe that would fundamentally shape his political theory. He spent 3 years studying political institutions firsthand in Austria, Hungary, Italy, Germany, Switzerland, the Dutch Republic, and most importantly, England. He didn't travel as a tourist. He traveled as a researcher, systematically observing how different political systems operated. He attended parliamentary sessions, interviewed politicians and administrators, studied legal systems, examined how power actually functioned versus how it was theoretically supposed to work. He was gathering empirical evidence for the grand comparative study he was planning. England fascinated him above all other countries. Why? Because it seemed to have solved a problem that plagued continental Europe. How to have stable, effective government that genuinely protected liberty without degenerating into either absolutism or chaotic anarchy. France had absolute monarchy, where the king's will was law. The German states had fragmented feudal authority with constant conflicts. The Italian city-states oscillated between republican government and tyranny. The Dutch Republic had republican institutions, but constant factional conflict that made governance difficult. England somehow had found a stable middle ground. It had limited monarchy, representative parliament, independent courts, and protection for individual liberties. English subjects enjoyed freedoms that continental Europeans could only dream of: freedom of speech, freedom from arbitrary arrest, property protections, and genuine political participation for a significant portion of the population. How did they achieve this? That was the question Montesquieu set out to answer. Montesquieu returned to France in 1731, convinced he had discovered the secret: institutional design. England's liberty didn't primarily depend on having particularly virtuous rulers or uniquely enlightened citizens. It depended on how power was structured, divided, and balanced among different institutions that naturally checked each other through competing interests. For the next 17 years, Montesquieu worked on his masterpiece. The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, was massive. Over 600 pages divided into 31 books covering an enormous range of topics. Climate's influence on laws and customs, the relationship between commerce and government forms, the proper way to tax citizens, the danger of standing armies, the nature of political liberty, the relationship between civil and criminal law, the differences between republics, monarchies, and despotisms, the role of religion in society, and much more.
The book defied easy categorization. It wasn't a systematic philosophical treatise arguing deductively from first principles like Hobbes's Leviathan. It wasn't a polemical tract advocating revolution like Rousseau's Future Social Contract. It was something genuinely new, a comparative study of political systems analyzing what makes governments work or fail, drawing on examples from ancient Rome to modern Europe, from Persia to China, from small republics to vast empires. The Catholic Church immediately recognized the book's challenge to absolute monarchy and religious authority.
They placed The Spirit of the Laws on the Index of Prohibited Books in 1751. But the intellectual momentum was unstoppable. The book became essential reading for anyone thinking seriously about politics, government, and constitutional design. It went through 22 editions in just 2 years. Montesquieu spent his remaining years defending and clarifying his ideas, though he never produced a systematic response to all its critics. He died in 1755 in Paris, 11 years before Rousseau's Social Contract would appear and decades before the American and French revolutions would attempt to implement Enlightenment political theories. But Montesquieu's ideas would prove more practically influential than any other Enlightenment philosophers. When French revolutionaries tried to implement Rousseau's radical direct democracy, they discovered it produced chaos, factionalism, and ultimately the terror. When American constitution makers followed Montesquieu's blueprint for separated powers and institutional checks, they created a stable government that has protected liberty for over 2 centuries. The question Montesquieu answered was this: how do you prevent tyranny through institutional design, rather than relying on impossible virtue, constant vigilance, or revolutionary upheaval? His answer: design institutions where power checks power through competing institutional interests became the foundation of modern constitutional government.
Montesquieu begins The Spirit of the Laws with a diagnosis of power that's simultaneously bleaker than Locke's optimism, but more pragmatic than either Hobbes's or Rousseau's approaches. His fundamental insight is deceptively simple, but profoundly true. Power, by its very nature, tends to expand and corrupt whoever holds it. This isn't primarily a moral claim about human wickedness or depravity. Montesquieu isn't saying humans are inherently evil or that power holders are uniquely vicious people. It's a more subtle observation about the nature of power itself, about how authority functions psychologically and institutionally. Power seeks more power. Authority, once established, naturally attempts to extend its reach. Those with power, whether kings, assemblies, judges, or democratic majorities, will inevitably attempt to expand that power unless something external constrains them. Notice the language. Not might abuse power. Not sometimes abuses it. Not evil people abuse it. Every person with power will abuse it if they can. This is eternal experience, as reliable and predictable as gravity or any natural law. It's not about individual character or moral virtue. It's about how power operates as a force in human affairs. And notice the mechanism. Power is carried as far as it will go. There's no natural stopping point. Power doesn't limit itself. The person or institution with authority will keep expanding it until they encounter resistance, until they hit some boundary, some obstacle, some countervailing force that says no further.
This creates the fundamental, inescapable problem of all political organization. How do you give government enough power to maintain order, provide security, protect rights, enforce laws, defend against external threats, and serve the common good, without giving it so much power that it becomes tyrannical? It's a genuine dilemma with no easy answer. Too little power and government cannot function. You get anarchy, chaos, the war of all against all that Hobbes feared. Too much power and government becomes oppressive. You get tyranny, despotism, the crushing of individual liberty that all Enlightenment thinkers opposed. Let's see how Montesquieu's predecessors tried to solve this problem and why he found their solutions inadequate. Hobbes had said, "Give the sovereign absolute power. Yes, this creates risk of tyranny, but that risk is better than the certainty of violent death in the state of nature's war of all against all. Create a Leviathan with unlimited authority. Trust that the sovereign's self-interest in maintaining order and prosperity will prevent the worst abuses. Accept that there's no right of resistance. Subjects cannot legitimately oppose the sovereign no matter what." Montesquieu's response: "This isn't solving the problem, it's surrendering to it. You're trading one form of insecurity, potential violence from others, for another, form certain subjection to unlimited authority. And history shows that absolute sovereigns do abuse their power. Trusting in their enlightened self-interest is naive. Locke had said, limit government through natural rights that precede political authority and through the social contract that government must respect. The people retain ultimate sovereignty and can overthrow governments that systematically violate the contract's terms. Create separation between legislative and executive powers. Trust that the people's right of revolution will constrain government from becoming too oppressive.
Montesquieu's response? This is better, but it still relies too heavily on popular revolution as the ultimate check. Revolution is costly, bloody, uncertain, and destructive. It's a remedy worse than many diseases. Moreover, Locke doesn't specify institutional mechanisms for day-to-day limitation of power. Between the people's theoretical right to revolution and government's actual exercise of power, there's too much space for tyranny to develop. Rousseau would say, keep sovereignty permanently with the people exercising direct legislative power. Never alienate or transfer sovereignty to representatives. The people themselves must continuously make laws through democratic assemblies. Government merely executes the people's will. It never substitutes for it. Montesquieu's implicit response, though he died before Rousseau's major works, this is beautiful in theory, but impossible in practice for any large, complex, modern nation. Direct democracy of the kind Rousseau demands requires small city-states with simple economies and highly virtuous, constantly engaged citizens. It's not a solution for real-world governance of large territories with diverse populations and complex administrative needs. So Montesquieu takes a different approach entirely. He stops looking for the right kind of person to hold power, the virtuous king, the enlightened citizens, the representative assembly. Instead, he asks, how do you structure institutions so that power limits power regardless of who holds office? His answer is brilliant in its pragmatism. Don't rely on virtue, wisdom, enlightenment, or popular vigilance. Design institutions where power checks power through competing institutional interests. Create a system where different parts of government have both the means and the motive to constrain each other.
Why is concentration of power so dangerous? Montesquieu writes, when the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or in the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty, because apprehensions may arise lest the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws to execute them in a tyrannical manner. Think carefully about what this means. If the same person or body that makes laws also enforces those laws, they can pass any law they want and then use force to impose it however they wish. No external check exists. They're accountable to no one. They can interpret their own laws, judge their own actions, and enforce their own will. That's the definition of tyranny, even if the particular laws seem reasonable initially, or the particular ruler seems benevolent. But Montesquieu continues, again, there is no liberty if the judiciary power be not separated from the legislative and executive. Were it joined with the legislative, the life and liberty of the subject would be exposed to arbitrary control, for the judge would then be the legislator. Were it joined to the executive power, the judge might behave with violence and oppression. This compounds the problem. If the lawmaker is also the judge, they can interpret laws however benefits themselves, changing meanings retroactively, punishing enemies, and protecting friends through biased interpretation. If the enforcer is also the judge, courts become instruments of persecution. The executive can use judicial power to crush opposition, eliminate rivals, and terrorize subjects into submission. In any of these combinations, justice becomes impossible. Law becomes merely the will of whoever holds the combined powers. Rights become meaningless because the same authority that supposedly protects them can reinterpret or violate them at will. This is Montesquieu's key insight,
and it's worth dwelling on because it's so fundamental to understanding modern constitutional government. The problem isn't just having a tyrant. The problem is creating institutional arrangements that make tyranny possible, even with well-meaning rulers.
Good intentions don't protect liberty if the structure concentrates power. Personal virtue doesn't prevent abuse if the institutions invite it. What matters is structure, design, architecture. If the structure concentrates power in any hands, whether one person, a small group, or even a democratic majority, it opens the door to arbitrary rule, oppression, and the destruction of liberty. Conversely, if the structure divides and balances power properly, liberty can survive and even flourish despite having imperfect, ambitious, and self-interested rulers. You don't need philosopher kings or enlightened despots or perfectly virtuous citizens. You just need the right institutional architecture. This is radically different from all previous political philosophy. Instead of asking who should rule, or what makes government legitimate, or what do citizens owe the state, Montesquieu asks, how should government be designed so that no one can rule tyrannically, regardless of their intentions or character? The answer is the separation of powers combined with checks and balances. Let's see how this works.
Montesquieu's solution is elegant in conception, but complex in implementation. Divide governmental functions into 3 distinct types. Assign each to different institutions controlled by different people, and ensure each can actively limit the others. These 3 powers are legislative, executive, and judicial. The legislative power is the authority to make laws, to decide what the general rules are, what behaviors society will require or forbid, what policies the state will pursue, what values it will enforce. This is fundamental sovereignty in a sense, the power to determine the basic framework within which everyone must operate. In a free state, Montesquieu argues, this power should belong to a representative body, the people's elected legislators, who debate and decide on general laws through deliberation and voting. Not a monarch making decrees, not judges creating law through interpretation, but a dedicated legislative assembly whose entire function is creating general rules. But Montesquieu adds a crucial refinement that most previous theorists had missed. The legislature itself should be divided internally. He envisions a bicameral system, 2 separate houses that must both approve legislation before it becomes law. Why divide the legislature? Because this creates an additional internal check before laws even reach the other branches. One house might be more democratic, representing population directly with frequent elections. Another might be more aristocratic or federal, representing regions or providing more deliberative consideration with longer terms. Neither can legislate alone. Both must agree. This forces compromise, prevents rash decisions driven by temporary passions, and ensures laws have broader support.
The bicameral model also allows different social classes or interests to have their own chamber where they can protect their legitimate concerns. The commons can check aristocratic privilege, the aristocracy can moderate democratic excess. Neither can oppress the other through legislation alone. The executive power is the authority to enforce laws, conduct foreign affairs, command the military, handle diplomatic relations, and manage the day-to-day administration of government. This requires unity, decisiveness, speed, and sometimes secrecy. Characteristics very different from legislative deliberation. Montesquieu argues the executive should be held by a single person, a monarch or president, who can act quickly and coherently. Committees fail in execution.
They deliberate endlessly, leak secrets, divide responsibility, and move too slowly for effective administration or military action. But, and this is absolutely crucial, the executive must not have legislative power. The executive enforces laws made by others, executes policies decided by the legislature, operates within boundaries set by law. The executive cannot simply decree whatever they want and then use force to impose it. That would collapse the separation and recreate tyranny. The executive's power is real and substantial, controlling the military, conducting diplomacy, appointing administrators, enforcing laws, but it's bounded by legislation. The executive can act only according to law, within limits set by the legislative power. The judicial power is the authority to interpret laws and judge specific cases, to determine whether laws were broken in particular situations, adjudicate disputes between parties, impose punishments on lawbreakers, and resolve uncertainties about what the law means in concrete circumstances.
This must be completely independent of both legislature and executive. Why? Because if the lawmaker judges cases, they can interpret their own laws however benefits them, changing meanings retroactively, protecting themselves and their allies while persecuting opponents. If the enforcer judges cases, courts become instruments of persecution. The executive uses judicial power to crush dissent, eliminate rivals, and legitimize oppression through legal forms. Only an independent judiciary can provide impartial justice, applying laws without fear or favor, protecting rights against both executive overreach and legislative tyranny, ensuring everyone receives equal treatment under law. Montesquieu goes further with an idea that would prove controversial. Judges should be strictly bound by law, not exercising personal discretion or creative interpretation. He writes, quote, "The national judges are no more than the mouth that pronounces the words of the law, mere passive beings, incapable of moderating either its force or rigor." This sounds mechanical, even dehumanizing, but Montesquieu's point is that judges should apply law as written, not make policy through judicial activism. If judges can effectively create new law through interpretation, they're exercising legislative power, collapsing the separation. Judges apply laws. They don't make them. Now here's where Montesquieu's genius truly shows. These three powers must be held by different people or groups with different interests and different motivations. Not just different offices that the same people rotate through, not just different functions that ultimately answer to the same authority, but genuinely separate institutions controlled by different individuals or groups who have their own reasons to protect their authority. Why does this matter so much? Because of Montesquieu's profound insight about human nature. Ambition counteracts ambition. Institutional self-interest becomes the engine of liberty.
The legislature wants power. Its members are ambitious, seek influence, want to expand their authority. If they could, they would dominate government completely. The executive wants power. The president or monarch is ambitious, seeks to act decisively, wants to expand authority. If possible, the executive would rule absolutely. The judiciary wants power. Judges seek influence, desire respect for their interpretations, want to expand judicial authority. They would dominate if they could. But when these three ambitious institutions are separate, each jealously guards its own turf against encroachment by the others. The legislature's ambition to expand checks the executive's ambition to dominate. The executive's ambition checks the legislature's. The judiciary's ambition checks both. This mutual jealousy, this competition for authority, creates a dynamic equilibrium. No branch can dominate because the others are watching, ready to resist any encroachment on their prerogatives.
Each branch's selfish desire to maintain and expand its own power becomes the mechanism that prevents any single branch from accumulating tyrannical authority. From this tension, this competition, liberty emerges. Not because everyone is virtuous or wise, not because institutions are perfectly designed, not because citizens are constantly vigilant, but because different people with different powers are all ambitious and none can dominate. This is Montesquieu's revolutionary insight, designing a system that works with human nature as it actually is, not as we wish it were. You don't need philosopher kings or enlightened citizens or virtuous rulers. You just need ambitious people in different positions watching each other jealously and protecting their own authority. It's not harmonious. It's not efficient. It's often frustrating and slow. But that's exactly the point. Montesquieu believes tyranny comes from government acting too easily, too quickly, too decisively, without opposition. Better to have gridlock than dictatorship. Better to have slow, messy, frustrating government where things are hard to accomplish than fast, efficient tyranny, where the ruler's will becomes law instantly. The separation of powers isn't designed to make government work smoothly. It's designed to make tyranny difficult. That's the priority. Liberty matters more than efficiency.
Separation of powers alone, just dividing government into 3 branches with different functions, isn't sufficient to prevent tyranny. Montesquieu recognized that truly protecting liberty requires specific, concrete mechanisms where each branch can actively check, limit, and constrain the other's power. This is what we call checks and balances, the practical tools each branch uses to prevent the others from becoming tyrannical. Let me walk through systematically how these checking mechanisms work in each direction. How the legislature checks the executive. First and most fundamentally, the legislature controls government funding. This is sometimes called the power of the purse, and it's enormously important. The executive cannot act without money. Want to enforce laws? You need to pay enforcers. Want to maintain an army? You need to pay soldiers. Want to administer programs? You need to pay administrators. Only the legislature can authorize spending. If the executive defies the legislature or exceeds constitutional authority, the legislature can defund the executive's operations, effectively paralyzing executive action. This gives the legislature tremendous leverage over the executive, even when it cannot directly command obedience. Second, the legislature can investigate executive actions. Legislative committees can summon executive officials, demand documents and testimony, expose wrongdoing, and bring public attention to executive abuses. This oversight function makes executives accountable even between elections. The threat of investigation, public embarrassment, and political consequences constrains executive behavior. Third, the legislature possesses the ultimate check: impeachment and removal. If executives commit serious misconduct, treason, bribery, abuse of power, betrayal of trust, the legislature can literally remove them from office through impeachment proceedings. This is the nuclear option, used rarely, but its very existence creates fear that constrains executive behavior.
Fourth, the legislature must approve major executive actions. Treaties require legislative ratification. Significant appointments need legislative confirmation. Declarations of war require legislative authorization. The executive cannot unilaterally commit the nation or staff the entire government without legislative cooperation. Fifth, the legislature can pass laws limiting executive discretion, specifying exactly how laws must be enforced, creating procedures executives must follow, and establishing oversight mechanisms. Through legislation, the legislature can hem in executive action, even in areas where the executive has theoretical authority. How the executive checks the legislature. The executive's primary check is the veto power. When the legislature passes legislation, the executive can refuse to sign it, sending it back unsigned. This forces the legislature to either compromise with the executive's objections or build overwhelming support to override the veto. The veto is powerful because it requires the legislature to achieve supermajority support for controversial measures. A slim majority cannot impose its will over executive objection. This prevents narrow majorities from enacting radical or poorly considered laws and forces broader consensus building. The executive also has substantial agenda-setting power. Through public addresses, policy proposals, media attention, and the prestige of office, executives can shape what the legislature debates. They can focus national attention on particular issues, generate public pressure for or against legislation, and influence the terms of political debate. This isn't a formal check, but it's a practical counterweight to legislative dominance.
In some constitutional systems, the executive can dissolve the legislature and call new elections. This nuclear option prevents legislative bodies from becoming permanently unresponsive to changing circumstances or public opinion. If the legislature and executive reach complete deadlock, the people can decide which side they support through fresh elections. The executive also exercises significant discretion in how laws are enforced and implemented. While they must enforce the law, how they prioritize enforcement, what regulations they promulgate to implement statutes, how aggressively they pursue violations, and how they interpret ambiguous legislative language gives executives substantial influence over actual policy outcomes. How the judiciary checks both. The judiciary's power is more subtle, but potentially more profound than either political branch. The fundamental judicial check is the power to declare laws or executive actions unconstitutional, striking them down as violations of fundamental law that neither branch could legitimately enact or enforce. This is judicial review, and while Montesquieu doesn't explicitly describe it in modern form, the logic of separation implies it. If the Constitution divides power among branches and sets limits on what each can do, some institution must be able to enforce those limits. That institution is naturally the judiciary, interpreting the Constitution and invalidating actions that exceed constitutional authority. Judicial review is enormously powerful because it can stop both political branches simultaneously. Even if the legislature and executive agree on a law, even if it has overwhelming popular support, if the judiciary finds it unconstitutional, the law is void. This makes courts the ultimate guardians of constitutional limits. Courts also protect individual rights against majority tyranny. Even if democratic majorities want to violate fundamental rights, suppressing unpopular speech, discriminating against minorities, taking property without compensation, courts can declare such actions unlawful. This is counter-majoritarian by design. Some things are beyond majority reach because they violate fundamental rights that constitutional order exists to protect.
Courts interpret ambiguous laws, filling gaps the legislature left and limiting executive discretion. When legislation is unclear or executive regulations seem to exceed statutory authority, courts determine what the law actually means. This interpretive power shapes policy profoundly, while ostensibly just applying existing law. Courts can also issue orders directly commanding executives to act or cease acting. Through writs of mandamus, injunctions, contempt citations, and other judicial orders, courts constrain executive power immediately. An executive who defies court orders faces not just political consequences but legal ones. Contempt charges, legal sanctions, and a legitimacy crisis. How the legislature checks the judiciary. Despite judicial power, the legislature possesses important checks on courts. First, the legislature must confirm judicial appointments.
Presidents or monarchs may nominate judges, but the legislature can reject nominees they find unsuitable. This gives the legislature influence over the judiciary's composition, philosophy, and likely future decisions. Second, the legislature can impeach and remove judges for serious misconduct. While this should be rare and limited to genuine offenses rather than disagreement with judicial decisions, it prevents the judiciary from becoming completely unaccountable. Judges who are corrupt, criminal, or fundamentally violate their oaths can be removed. Third, the legislature can alter the structure of courts through legislation. They can create new courts, eliminate existing ones, modify jurisdiction, adjust procedures, change the number of judges, and restructure the judicial system in various ways. This structural control limits judicial power over the long term. Fourth, the legislature can pass new legislation overriding judicial interpretations of statutes. If courts interpret a law in ways the legislature didn't intend, the legislature can amend the law to make its intent clearer. This doesn't work for constitutional interpretation. You can't simply pass a new law overriding constitutional decisions. But for ordinary statutory interpretation, legislative override is always possible. Fifth, in extreme cases, the legislature can propose constitutional amendments to override judicial decisions they find intolerable. This requires extraordinary supermajorities and is very difficult, but it's the ultimate legislative check on judicial constitutional interpretation. How the executive checks the judiciary? The executive nominates judges, shaping the judiciary's composition over time. A president or monarch who serves long enough can transform the judiciary through appointments, selecting judges who share their constitutional philosophy and policy preferences. The executive also controls judicial enforcement. Courts issue orders and render judgments, but executives must enforce them. If executives refuse to enforce judicial decisions, those decisions become mere words on paper. An executive who systematically defies courts creates a constitutional crisis, but the judiciary's dependence on executive enforcement remains real. The executive can also influence cases through the Solicitor General or Attorney General's office, which represents the government in legal proceedings. How aggressively the executive defends or challenges laws, what legal arguments it makes, what cases it appeals or declines to appeal, all these affect judicial decisions indirectly. Do you see the intricate web being woven here? Every branch has multiple ways to limit every other branch. No single institution can dominate because others have weapons to resist. Power is not just separated, it's actively balanced through these checking mechanisms. The beauty and genius of this system is that it harnesses selfish institutional interest for the public good. Each branch wants to protect and expand its own power. Each resents encroachment from the others. Each is jealous of its prerogatives and quick to resist when another branch oversteps. This mutual jealousy, this competition for authority, creates a dynamic equilibrium where no branch can accumulate tyrannical power because the others will resist. Their institutional selfishness becomes our protection. It's not a system that requires virtue, wisdom, or enlightenment. It's a system designed to work even when leaders are selfish, ambitious, and power-hungry. Because they're selfish and ambitious, they'll naturally defend their institution's authority against encroachment. Their vice becomes our liberty's guardian. This is Montesquieu's profound insight into political architecture, building a machine that functions properly even when operated by imperfect humans.
Montesquieu developed his theory of separation of powers primarily by observing England, which he believed had successfully implemented the separation he advocated. England's liberty, he thought, was directly attributable to its institutional structure. But here's something fascinating that historians have long recognized. Montesquieu fundamentally misunderstood how the English system actually worked.
This misunderstanding would prove extraordinarily productive, perhaps more influential than if he had understood England correctly. Let me explain. Montesquieu saw England as having perfectly distinct legislative, executive, and judicial powers held by genuinely separate bodies. Parliament made laws through deliberation and voting. The king executed those laws through royal ministers in the administrative apparatus. Independent courts judged cases impartially. The three branches were institutionally separate, balanced each other, and thereby protected English liberty. This seemed to Montesquieu like the perfect realization of his theoretical model. Here was empirical proof that separation of powers worked in practice, not just in theory. England's evident success, its stability, prosperity, and liberty compared to continental absolutism validated his entire framework. But the reality of the English system was far more complicated and, in crucial respects, contradicted Montesquieu's model. First, the executive, the king's ministers, were not separate from the legislature. They sat in Parliament. The prime minister and cabinet members were drawn from Parliament and remained members while holding executive office. They weren't separate institutions at all. They were literally the same people wearing different hats at different moments. This meant the executive and legislative branches were fused rather than separated. The government derived from and remained accountable to Parliament. If Parliament withdrew confidence, the government fell. This is the opposite of separation. It's institutional interdependence. Second, the House of Lords functioned as both a legislative chamber and the highest court of appeal. The same body that made laws also judged the most important cases. This directly violated Montesquieu's insistence that judicial power must be absolutely separate from legislative. Third, the monarchy retained significant legislative power through various mechanisms. The king could summon and dissolve Parliament, veto legislation, create peers who then voted in the Lords, and influence parliamentary proceedings through patronage and influence. The separation of legislative and executive power was far less clean than Montesquieu described. Fourth, Parliament itself claimed sovereignty, ultimate, undivided authority over the entire political system. The famous formulation attributed to jurist William Blackstone was that Parliament could do anything except make a man a woman or a woman a man. No constitutional limits constrained Parliament's authority. This contradicts the idea of separated powers with none supreme. So how did Montesquieu get England so wrong? Several reasons. He was observing a system in transition. The modern parliamentary system, where the prime minister and cabinet are explicitly and formally drawn from and accountable to Parliament, was still developing in Montesquieu's time. The formal structure, king, parliament, courts, obscured the emerging reality of parliamentary supremacy and executive-legislative fusion. He was looking for confirmation of his theory. Montesquieu believed separation of powers was the key to liberty. He saw that England had both liberty and what appeared to be institutional separation. Confirmation bias led him to see what he expected rather than what actually existed. He interpreted ambiguous evidence in ways that supported his theoretical framework.
He may have deliberately simplified for rhetorical effect. Montesquieu was writing for a French audience living under absolute monarchy. Describing England as having perfectly separated powers made a powerful point about how different and better constitutional government was compared to French absolutism. Whether he fully understood English complexity or strategically simplified, the message resonated. Whatever the reasons, Montesquieu's account of England was more idealized theory than accurate description. But here's the fascinating twist. This misreading proved extraordinarily productive and influential.
England's actual liberty didn't primarily depend on separation of powers as Montesquieu conceived it. It depended on parliamentary sovereignty, Parliament's supreme authority over executive and judiciary, combined with political conventions, cultural traditions of liberty, gradual evolution of rights through custom and precedent, and checks created through party competition and parliamentary procedures rather than institutional separation. The English Constitution was unwritten, based on precedent, convention, and evolved practice accumulated over centuries. What protected liberty wasn't systematic institutional separation, but rather parliamentary control over the executive through confidence votes, question periods, the constant threat of dismissal, and the executive's dependence on maintaining parliamentary majorities. Yet, Montesquieu's theoretical model of how England should work became the blueprint for how new governments would work in the future. His idealized, purified version of separation of powers, even though it didn't accurately describe England, proved more practically useful for constitution makers than England's actual messy reality. When the American founders designed their constitution, they didn't copy the actual English system with its parliamentary fusion and flexible conventions. They copied Montesquieu's idealized version with strict separation, written constitutional limits, and formal checks and balances. Similarly, when French revolutionaries wrote constitutions, when Latin American independence movements created new governments, when post-colonial nations designed institutions, they used Montesquieu's model, not England's actual system.
This raises profound questions about the relationship between theory and practice. Can a philosopher's misinterpretation of reality create a new reality more influential than what actually existed? Can idealized theory be more practically useful than accurate description? In Montesquieu's case, absolutely yes. His clean, systematic, theoretical model proved easier to implement from scratch than trying to replicate England's organically evolved complexity. When you're writing a constitution on blank paper, you need clear principles, not accumulated traditions. Montesquieu provided that. The result is that modern democracies follow two fundamentally different models. Parliamentary democracies like the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, and most of Europe follow the actual English model, fused executive and legislative branches where the government is drawn from and accountable to Parliament, with parliamentary sovereignty as the organizing principle. Presidential democracies like the United States, France, and many Latin American countries follow Montesquieu's idealized model. Strictly separated branches with formal checks and balances, written constitutional limits, and no institution claiming absolute sovereignty. Both models work. Both protect liberty reasonably well, but they do it through fundamentally different mechanisms. One through parliamentary control of government, the other through separated powers checking each other. This suggests that Montesquieu captured something important, even while getting empirical details wrong. The principle that power must be limited through institutional mechanisms rather than relying solely on virtue or popular vigilance holds true even if specific implementations vary. Whether through parliamentary fusion with government accountability or presidential separation with formal checks and balances, the goal is the same: prevent concentration of power that enables tyranny. Different institutional designs can achieve that goal through different means.
When the American founders gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to draft a constitution for their new nation, they brought one book more than any other: Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws. His influence on the American Constitution is so profound that the document reads like a deliberate, systematic attempt to implement his theory in practice. James Madison, the Constitution's primary architect and often called the father of the Constitution, was completely saturated in Montesquieu's ideas. In Federalist number 47, Madison writes, "The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny." That sentence is pure Montesquieu, not just quoting him, but treating his principle as axiomatic, the foundation on which everything else must build. Concentration of power equals tyranny, regardless of who holds it or how they obtained it. This is the starting premise of American constitutional design. The Constitution's structure directly and systematically implements Montesquieu's blueprint. Article 1 establishes the legislative branch in the very first article, signaling its primacy. Congress is composed of two separate chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate, that must both approve legislation before it becomes law. This creates Montesquieu's internal check within the legislature itself, preventing rash or tyrannical legislation from passing without broad support. The House represents population directly, with frequent two-year elections making it responsive to current popular sentiment. The Senate originally represented state governments with 6-year staggered terms, later changed to direct election, but retaining the structure, providing a more deliberate, stable consideration, less swayed by temporary passions. Neither chamber can legislate alone. They both must agree. This forces compromise, moderation, and broader consensus for all federal legislation.
Article 2 establishes the executive branch, a single president who enforces laws, conducts foreign policy, commands the military, and manages federal administration. Unitary executive power for decisiveness and coherence, exactly as Montesquieu recommended. But the president's powers are carefully enumerated and limited. The president cannot make laws, only execute those Congress passes. Cannot declare war, only wage war Congress authorizes. Cannot spend money, only administer funds Congress appropriates. Cannot make treaties alone, requires Senate approval. Cannot appoint major officials unilaterally, requires Senate confirmation. The president is elected separately from Congress through the Electoral College system, ensuring institutional independence. The president doesn't depend on congressional majorities for remaining in office, unlike parliamentary systems, which protects against congressional domination. Article 3 establishes the judicial branch, federal courts with judges appointed for life terms during good behavior, ensuring independence from political pressure. Judges can be removed only through impeachment for serious misconduct, not for unpopular decisions. The judiciary interprets laws, judges cases, and protects constitutional rights against both political branches. Though judicial review, the power to declare laws unconstitutional, isn't explicitly stated in Article 3, it's implied by the logic of separation and was asserted by the Supreme Court itself in Marbury v. Madison, 1803. 3 separate articles, 3 separate branches, 3 separate powers. The separation couldn't be clearer or more systematic. But the founders went beyond mere separation, implementing elaborate checks and balances that Montesquieu only sketched. Presidential veto power. The president can reject legislation Congress passes, forcing them to either compromise or build a two-thirds supermajority to override. This prevents slim congressional majorities from imposing their will and requires broader consensus for controversial measures.
Senate approval of treaties and appointments. Major executive actions require Senate consent, ensuring the executive cannot unilaterally commit the nation or staff government with loyalists. Congressional control of spending. All federal expenditures require congressional appropriation. The president proposes budgets, but Congress decides what gets funded, giving Congress ultimate leverage over executive actions. Impeachment and removal. Congress can impeach and remove the president, vice president, and all federal judges for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. This is the ultimate check, allowing removal of officials who fundamentally betray their trust. Judicial review. Though not explicit in the Constitution's text, courts can declare laws and executive actions unconstitutional, checking both political branches simultaneously. Senate confirmation of judges. The president nominates federal judges, but the Senate must confirm them. This ensures judicial appointments require agreement between branches and prevents either branch from controlling the judiciary alone. Different constituencies and terms. Representatives serve 2 years, elected by districts. Senators serve 6 years, originally chosen by state legislatures, now directly elected, with only 1/3 elected at once. Presidents serve 4 years, elected by the Electoral College. Judges serve for life. This staggering prevents any single election from transforming government completely and ensures different institutions answer to different constituencies at different times. The founders also added innovations Montesquieu hadn't imagined. Federalism, dividing power between national and state governments, creates another layer of checks. Neither level is completely sovereign. Both have distinct spheres of authority. States can resist federal overreach. The federal government can override state tyranny. Power is divided vertically as well as horizontally. Specific enumerated powers. Congress can only legislate in areas specifically granted by the Constitution. All other powers are reserved to states or the people, per the 10th Amendment. This limits national government through defined boundaries, rather than trusting institutional rivalry alone.
The Bill of Rights, specific protections for individual liberties that no branch of government and no majority can violate. Speech, religion, press, assembly, arms, due process, jury trials, protection against self-incrimination, prohibition of cruel punishment, all explicitly protected against governmental violation. These amendments go beyond Montesquieu's institutional checks to protect rights through explicit constitutional guarantees. Neither Congress, nor the president, nor courts, nor even constitutional majorities can legitimately violate these rights. Difficult amendment process. Changing the Constitution requires either 2/3 of both houses of Congress or conventions in 2/3 of states to propose amendments, then ratification by 3/4 of states. This extraordinary requirement means the Constitution changes slowly and only with overwhelming consensus. Some criticize this as making the Constitution too rigid, unable to adapt to changing circumstances. But the founders saw it as essential protection against temporary majorities imposing radical changes that violate fundamental principles. Better a rigid constitution that protects liberty than a flexible one that can be manipulated by whoever temporarily controls government.
The result of all this elaborate institutional architecture is a system that critics call gridlock-prone, inefficient, and frustrating. Passing major legislation is extremely difficult. Different branches regularly deadlock. Important problems go unaddressed for years or decades. Reform is painfully slow.
But that's exactly what Montesquieu intended and what the founders designed. The system is supposed to make change difficult. It's supposed to require broad, sustained consensus. It's supposed to prevent quick, decisive action by narrow majorities or ambitious executives. Why? Because the founders, following Montesquieu, believed that tyranny comes from concentrated power acting swiftly and decisively. Liberty requires that government be slow, divided, and constrained. Better to have gridlock than tyranny. Better to have important things undone than to have government powerful enough to oppress. And remarkably, it has worked. The U.S. Constitution is now over 235 years old, the oldest written constitution still in operation anywhere in the world. It has survived civil war, economic collapse, world wars, profound social transformations, technological revolutions, and dramatic expansions of both territory and population.
Why has it lasted when so many other constitutions have failed, been discarded, or required complete replacement? Because Montesquieu's design makes tyranny difficult. Not impossible. History shows that determined authoritarians can undermine any system, but difficult, requiring sustained effort and multiple institutional failures simultaneously. For tyranny to succeed in the American system, the legislature, executive, and judiciary must all fail at once. The president must overstep authority, Congress must acquiesce rather than checking, and courts must refuse to intervene. All three branches must be captured or corrupted simultaneously. That's a high bar. Moreover, even if the federal government is captured, states retain significant authority and can resist, even if one political party controls all elected branches. Life-tenured judges appointed by previous administrations remain independent. Even if the government acts, constitutional rights place certain actions beyond governmental authority regardless of consensus. This is Montesquieu's vision realized, a government that protects liberty not through leaders' virtue, but through institutional structure that makes tyranny hard.
While separation of powers is Montesquieu's most famous contribution, the spirit of the laws contains other crucial insights that profoundly influenced constitutional thinking and deserve attention. First, different governments suit different conditions, political relativism, and contextual design. Montesquieu emphatically was not a one-size-fits-all thinker. Throughout The Spirit of the Laws, he argues that appropriate political systems vary with geography, climate, culture, economy, size, history, and social conditions. What works brilliantly in one context might fail catastrophically in another. Small city-states can sustain direct democracy, where citizens know each other personally and can actually assemble to deliberate. Large nations with dispersed populations must use representation because direct participation is physically impossible. Commercial societies with complex economies need different legal systems than simple agricultural societies. Property laws must reflect economic realities. Contract enforcement becomes crucial in commercial republics, but matters less in subsistence societies. Climate and geography shape social relations and appropriate institutions. Hot climates produce different social structures, family relations, and governmental needs than cold climates. Island nations face different challenges than continental powers. Mountains create natural barriers that affect political organization. This relativism troubled some Enlightenment thinkers who sought universal principles applicable everywhere. But Montesquieu's point wasn't that anything goes or that all systems are equally good. Rather, abstract theories must adapt to concrete circumstances.
institutional design must fit context or it will fail.
This influenced American founders' pragmatism. They didn't try to implement pure theory or copy any existing system entirely. They designed institutions suited to American circumstances. A large federal republic spanning diverse states with different economies, climates, and cultures. They adapted Montesquieu's principles to their specific situation rather than applying them mechanically. Second, the importance of intermediate powers, social pluralism, and institutional buffers. Montesquieu argues that between the supreme authority, monarch or popular sovereignty, and individual citizens, you need intermediary institutions, nobility, local governments, professional associations, religious bodies, regional parliaments, corporate entities. These create buffers, preventing direct confrontation between absolute central power and atomized individuals. Without intermediate powers, you have either tyranny, centralized authority crushing individuals who have no collective organization to resist, or anarchy, masses overthrowing all authority with no stable institutions to replace it.
Intermediate institutions serve multiple functions. They provide alternative centers of authority that can resist central tyranny. They organize citizens into communities with collective identity and interests. They create multiple overlapping allegiances that prevent any single authority from claiming total loyalty. They're shock absorbers in the political system, moderating conflicts before they reach a crisis. This influenced thinking about federalism and civil society. Power should be dispersed not just horizontally among branches, but also vertically among levels of government and socially among various institutions and associations. Liberty depends on multiple centers of power, none supreme, none able to dominate all others. Third, moderation as the supreme political virtue. Throughout the spirit of the laws, Montesquieu consistently advocates moderation, balance, and avoiding extremes. He opposes absolute monarchy, but also warns against pure democracy. He supports commerce, but cautions against pure commercialism. He values religion, but opposes theocracy. He wants liberty, but recognizes that unlimited liberty becomes license.
The best political systems, for Montesquieu, are mixed governments combining different elements: monarchical efficiency, aristocratic wisdom, democratic legitimacy. No single principle pursued absolutely, but multiple goods balanced carefully against each other. This moderation permeates his entire approach to politics. He's suspicious of revolutionary upheaval and utopian schemes. He prefers gradual evolution, incremental change, and adaptation to circumstances over radical transformation based on abstract principles. Fourth, the rule of law rather than the rule of men. Constitutionalism as fundamental. Perhaps Montesquieu's deepest contribution is insistence that laws, not individuals, should rule. Even kings must follow laws. Even judges must apply them consistently according to established principles. The moment government becomes personal, based on whoever's in charge rather than predetermined rules, liberty dies. Constitutional government means government bound by law, where officials exercise authority according to predetermined rules, rather than personal whim or arbitrary discretion. This requires written laws, regular procedures, and predictable enforcement. Citizens must be able to know what's required of them and plan their lives accordingly. When law rules rather than men, everyone, from the highest official to the poorest subject, stands equal before it. No one is above the law. No one can change rules arbitrarily to benefit themselves or punish enemies. Law creates the framework within which all political action occurs, binding rulers as firmly as ruled. Fifth, the importance of political culture and civic virtue.
Institutions shape character. While Montesquieu relies less on civic virtue than Rousseau, he recognizes that institutions alone don't determine outcomes. Political culture matters. Citizens must value liberty, respect law, participate responsibly, and resist tyranny. Some degree of civic virtue remains essential.
But crucially, Montesquieu argues institutions shape culture over time. Good institutional design encourages civic virtue. Bad design corrupts it. By creating government where power checks power, where officials are accountable, where rights are protected, you create incentives for responsible behavior and disincentives for tyranny. The structure itself teaches citizens political lessons. When they see officials constrained by law, checked by other branches, held accountable for abuses, they learn to value constitutional limits. When they see rights protected, even against majorities, they learn liberty means more than majority rule. The institutions themselves become civic education. Sixth, the danger of standing armies and military power. Montesquieu warns repeatedly that permanent military forces threaten liberty. Armies not actively fighting foreign wars naturally turn inward, becoming potential tools for domestic oppression. Military discipline contradicts civic freedom. Soldiers loyal to commanders rather than constitutional authority can enforce tyranny. Large, standing armies create constant temptation for rulers to use military force against internal opposition. They normalize obedience and hierarchy in ways inconsistent with Republican liberty. They drain resources that could support commerce and civic institutions. This influenced profound American suspicion of standing armies and preference for citizen militias reflected in the Second Amendment. It's also why modern democracies carefully subordinate military to civilian control, limit domestic military deployment, and maintain clear separation between military and law enforcement functions.
So where does Montesquieu leave us? What is his enduring legacy to political thought and practice? And what are his theory's genuine limitations that we must acknowledge honestly? Montesquieu gave us something truly revolutionary: institutional architecture as the primary foundation of political liberty. Before him, political philosophy had focused overwhelmingly on who should rule. Should it be kings or people, aristocrats or citizens, the wise or the many, the virtuous or the legitimate? Montesquieu fundamentally shifted the question to how government should be structured, regardless of who holds office. His answer: it doesn't ultimately matter who rules if the system prevents tyranny through intelligent institutional design that divides power and creates checking mechanisms among competing centers of authority. Virtue is desirable but unreliable. You can't count on rulers being wise or good. Wisdom is valuable but rare. You can't depend on finding philosopher kings. Popular vigilance is necessary but exhausting. Citizens cannot constantly watch government to prevent tyranny. What you can count on is institutional self-interest, each branch jealously protecting its own power against encroachment, creating dynamic equilibrium where no one can dominate. This is Montesquieu's genius and his absolutely enduring contribution to political thought. Nearly 280 years after The Spirit of the Laws was published, we still build governments according to his essential blueprint. Separation of powers, checks and balances, judicial independence, bicameral legislatures, constitutional limits on authority. These are the default standard features of modern constitutional democracy worldwide. The proof of his influence is simply overwhelming. The American Constitution implements his models systematically.
The French constitutions of 1791 and subsequent versions tried to incorporate separation of powers. Latin American independence movements built their new governments on Montesquieu's principles. Post-colonial nations, from India to South Africa, designed constitutions featuring separated powers. The European Union's institutional structure echoes his logic. Even authoritarian regimes pay lip service to separation of powers because Montesquieu made it the international standard of governmental legitimacy. Yes, his theory has real limitations we must acknowledge. Gridlock is genuine and costly. When powers are separated and constantly checking each other, sometimes nothing gets done. Important legislation dies in deadlock. Crises go unaddressed. Needed reforms are blocked. Is protecting against tyranny worth the cost of governmental paralysis? Montesquieu says yes, but it's a real trade-off with real costs. He fundamentally misread England. His model doesn't accurately describe how England actually worked. Parliamentary systems with fused executive-legislative branches protect liberty without strict separation. Countries like Britain, Canada, Germany, and Australia demonstrate that Montesquieu's specific institutional prescription isn't the only way to protect freedom. Modern challenges strain his model in ways he couldn't anticipate. Administrative agencies that combine legislative rulemaking, executive enforcement, and judicial adjudication. Emergency powers that temporarily concentrate authority. National security claims that resist traditional checks. Intelligence agencies operating in secrecy. The rise of political parties that can coordinate action across branches, potentially overcoming institutional separation. The system leaks and adapts in ways Montesquieu didn't perceive. Separation can be captured if all branches fall under control of a unified faction. If the same political party or ideological movement controls presidency, Congress, and through prior appointments the judiciary, checking mechanisms can fail. Partisan loyalty might trump institutional loyalty, collapsing the separation that protects liberty.
But despite these genuine limitations, Montesquieu's fundamental framework remains indispensable for understanding and protecting constitutional government. Why? Because he solved a problem that every free society perpetually faces. How do you prevent tyranny without relying on the impossible virtue of rulers or the exhausting constant vigilance of citizens? His answer: design institutions where power checks power through competing institutional interests works. Not perfectly, not in every circumstance, not without adaptation to specific contexts, but it works better than available alternatives. Better than trusting in virtuous rulers who inevitably disappoint. Better than hoping citizens will remain constantly vigilant when they're busy living their lives. Better than concentrating power in any single person or body and trusting they won't abuse it. The proof is in historical results. Governments built explicitly on Montesquieu's principles, particularly the United States Constitution, have protected liberty longer and more successfully than virtually any other governmental system in human history. The Constitution has endured over 235 years through civil war, economic catastrophe, world wars, profound social transformations, and dramatic changes in territory, population, and circumstances. Parliamentary democracies, though structurally different, have incorporated many Montesquieu's principles: judicial independence, constitutional limits, institutional checks, even within parliamentary systems through bicameralism, federalism, and strong committee systems. Even when they don't follow his specific model, they honor his core insight. Power must be divided, checked, and limited institutionally. Even authoritarian regimes feel compelled to simulate separation of powers, creating facade institutions that pretend to check executive authority. Why bother with the pretense? Because Montesquieu's ideas made constitutionalism with separated powers the international standard of legitimate government. Naked tyranny without institutional pretense became illegitimate in ways it wasn't before Montesquieu.
This is Montesquieu's ultimate gift to humanity. Not perfect government, immune to all abuse, but government deliberately designed to work with imperfect humans as they actually are. Government that assumes ambition, selfishness, power-seeking, and institutional rivalry and uses those very human vices to protect liberty. Government that doesn't require philosophical wisdom, moral perfection, or constant popular mobilization, but just institutional jealousy and constitutional structure intelligently designed. When you hear about checks and balances, about separation of powers, about constitutional limits on governmental authority, about judicial review, about federalism, about bicameral legislatures, about any of the institutional mechanisms that characterize modern constitutional democracy, remember, that's not ancient wisdom discovered in classical texts. That's not natural law written in the cosmos. That's Montesquieu. One French aristocrat, studying governments comparatively, traveling Europe to observe institutions firsthand, thinking deeply and systematically about how political systems actually function rather than how they theoretically should function, and then writing it all down in a massive, sprawling, endlessly fascinating book that became the operating system, the basic architecture, the fundamental blueprint of constitutional democracy. The spirit of the laws isn't just philosophy or political theory. It's the instruction manual we still follow when building free governments.
Thank you for joining me on Timeless Thinkers. Next time, we'll explore another philosopher whose ideas shaped the world we inhabit. Until then, keep thinking, keep questioning, keep learning.